Hello, everyone, and welcome to this online seminar from the Helen Hamlin Centre for Pedagogy on how do multilingual children experience primary school. My name is Alice Bradbury. I'm delighted to be chairing and presenting in this seminar today, and it's great to see lots of people attending. You're all very welcome to our online event. I'm the co-director of the Helen Hamlin Centre for Pedagogy at UCL, the Institute of Education. We are a research centre funded by the Helen Hamlin Trust, and we are focused on primary and early years education. I've got a few housekeeping things to mention before we start. I'm going to be joined today by my colleague Charlotte Hacking, who is our teacher engagement lead, and also Emily Rankin, who is a research assistant within the centre. The session is going to last for 1 hour, and I have to also inform you that we are recording it. We're going to make this recording available to all the participants after the webinar, so feel free to come back and have a look again or share it with your colleagues if you wish. We also post our seminars on our YouTube channel as well if you want to share them afterwards. You can find today's programme and any of the links in the chat box, which Hassan is manning over there. And we're also going to post some additional resources here through the session. There is a Q&A box for questions, which we'll come to at the end. So please put your questions there. And this helps to kind of keep everything organised for us. And we're going to try and get through as many as possible in the Q&A section at the end. If you have any technical issues or any comments, please use the chat function. If you have any problems, of course, with audio or video, let us know there, and we will do our best to help. So, housekeeping over, we are going to talk about this project, which I have been leading here at UCL Institute of Education. We began this, Emily and I together, and Charlotte has kind of joined the team, because we're both really interested in how multilingual children are experiencing primary school in the current context. We are both ex-primary teachers. We are both experienced in teaching many children with English as additional language. And Emily in particular is really focused on research in this field. The project itself was funded by the Randolph Quirk Memorial Fund, who fund research to do with language. So we're grateful to them. And it really is quite an exploratory project, just trying to find out this answer to this very simple question of how multilingual children are experiencing primary school. I'm going to hand over first to Emily to explain the project and talk about why this issue matters. And then we're going to set out some of our findings and also talk about what this might mean for practice in schools. Thank you, Emily.
Great. Thank you, Alice. Thanks, everyone, for coming. So, as Alice said, this project, we're really interested in how multilingual children themselves experience primary school. And the reason why this matters, the latest statistics show that about 23% of primary school pupils in England are English as an additional language learners. So this is a huge amount of children in the country. The definition EAL, which we're going to use in this seminar, is an interesting one because it doesn't necessarily mean that these children have low English proficiency or say anything about sort of their migration histories or when they might have come to this country or when their parents might have done. It's purely a measure of, have these children been exposed to a language other than English? And so this means that there's a huge variation in their experiences, whether they have learned both English and another language at the same time, whether they've learned one before the other, their sort of levels of literacy in the languages that they know is hugely variable. And then that's all sort of within the context where obviously in different parts of the UK, you have different levels of migration. So you'll have different school populations, different languages spoken other than English. And then also within the policy context where EAL doesn't always get the attention that we might feel it deserves. And then on top of this, we were particularly interested in what children themselves think, sort of according with the United Nations rights of the child, Article 12, which is children having the right to be listened to and taken seriously. And we think that asking children about these things can be really, really valuable, and tell us a lot that we might not otherwise find out. So just a quick note on a few previous research studies in this area. Research that directly asks multilingual children about their experiences tends to be quite small scale, quite exploratory, similar to what we've done here. But there's a few indications of what is important to children here. So children tended to have sort of quite mixed attitudes towards their home languages, and whether they valued them more or less than English is not very conclusive. Peer dynamics, friendships are really important when children talk about the languages that they know, as I'm going to talk about a bit more in our findings. As I've mentioned, sort of school type is really important, and location. So there's some evidence that suggests that teachers in rural areas might feel less confident teaching EAL children, which makes sense if it's not something that they have to contend with in their daily practice. And teachers' beliefs about multilingualism do shape kind of how language is used in the classroom. So if teachers are supportive of the use of other languages, obviously those might be sort of more commonly used in the classroom. And then again, as I mentioned, there's sort of limited national policy on EAL support, and it tends to be up to the individual school, the individual teacher to figure out the best ways that they can support these children. So our research, we did focus groups in 4 primary schools. And in total, we spoke to 27 pupils in year 5 and 6. And between them, they spoke 19 different languages other than English. We also interviewed 9 teachers from those schools and EAL leads, although only one of the schools actually had EAL lead, which I think Alice is going to talk about a bit later on. Our research questions were: how do EAL pupils describe their experiences? And how does school context shape these experiences? So the schools that we spoke to were all quite different. We wanted to get a really kind of big variation in those schools, so we can start to sort of address that second question about school context and how children's experiences might differ. So they are sort of around London, because that is where we're based, and it's a small study, but it's definitely something that needs to be done. Is kind of look a bit further afield in England at different schools in different areas. But we tried to get a good variation from what we could. So the first school was sort of out in East London suburbs, a local authority school. About 35% of children had English as an additional language, so higher than the national average, but quite a low proportion of free school meals, which we use as a sort of proxy for socioeconomic deprivation. Second school was in central London, also a local authority school. The highest proportion of children with English as an additional language, 69% of children, and also a very high proportion of children on free school meals. This school was quite interesting because most children there spoke the same language other than English. So most children there spoke English, and then also Bengali was the main second language there. Third school was more rural. It had only 10% of children speaking English as an additional language, so much lower than the national average, and also lower than average proportion of children on free school meals. And then the fourth school was probably, I think, the closest to the average, the national average on both of those measures. So really different contexts of these schools that we work with. Okay, so to collect our data, we did some focus groups with children, was the sort of main thing. And what we did was various different activities to kind of really get children talking about their experiences, what they thought about their multilingualism, what they thought about their languages. So we did some ranking activities where children had to order different concepts, and kind of their discussions around that were really interesting to see. And we had an opinion line. Children had to tell us their opinions on whether they thought their home languages would be, whether they supported the use of their home languages in the classroom. We had a lot of group discussions around this sort of thing. And then the final task that we asked them to do was to imagine that a new pupil had joined their class, who didn't know very much English and what sorts of things they thought would be useful to support her. So you can see on the post-it notes that I've included here some of their ideas. So Sophia is the name of this fictional child. One child has said, I think she should talk to people who speak the same language and they could teach her. That we should support her and teach her some English, make sure she feels welcome, be her friend. She would need translation and support from the teachers. She would need more time to listen and for instructions. So they had some really interesting ideas around that. And then we also interviewed teachers, school leaders, and EAL leads as well. So our findings, that first research question, how do EAL pupils describe their experiences? We've kind of categorized it into different themes. So first of all, around identity. So most of the children we spoke to considered that being multilingual was a positive thing. They felt that it made them special, and it was a good skill, some of them talked about as well. Some children did talk about sort of having some challenges switching languages between different contexts. There was one child who talks about going on holiday back to Lithuania, and then when he came back, he had to spend a day sort of readjusting. But in general, they tended to feel like it was like a positive thing. Children's attitudes towards those languages was quite interesting. They tended to describe English as something that was really useful for them for practical purposes. So for doing well in school, for getting a job later on, that was their kind of reason that English was important to them. Whereas their home languages, they discussed in a way that was much more linked to this sort of comfort and belonging. And a couple of the children said that if they used their home languages in school, that it might potentially make them feel more comfortable. So it was more of kind of an emotional way of talking about those languages. I've just got a quote from Elif here from School 3, who suggested that instead of learning French or Spanish, which a lot of the children learned in their sort of curriculum, he thought that the children should learn each other's languages to understand each other's backgrounds and things like that. Which in this group, we had quite a bit of a discussion around that and how most of the children felt that, they enjoyed learning French and Spanish, but they didn't quite have an attachment to it as the same way. And they felt that learning each other's sort of home languages might be more useful, more interesting for them. So peer relationships and friendships this was probably the most important theme of what children talked about in their experiences, which surprised us a little bit. We were sort of expecting them to talk about their learning a bit more, but no, it was all about friendships and how their multilingualism impacted those. And that was friendships both with children who spoke the same home language as them and children who spoke other languages. So Mina has said, when I speak Turkish with my friends, because they know the same language, it's like we have a connection and we understand each other. And that was quite common for children to, make friendships with others who spoke the same languages at home. A couple of the children did mention some more negative things around sort of their peer relationships in relation to their languages. So Kareem in School 3 said that if he spoke his home language at school, that hearing something other children are not used to might be strange to them. And when you feel strange, it makes you feel uncomfortable. And this was the school that had a much lower proportion of multilingual children. So that's interesting. That was also the school where children kind of reported a little bit more negativity that they'd experienced from their peers around their languages. Parents was another topic that came up. We found that children quite often translated for their parents when, parents were talking to teachers and things to do with the school. Some children sort of played that role of the translator. But most of them felt that their parents would be quite positive about them using their home languages in school and helping other children. So Alina has said, my mum would probably think I'm letting people learn other languages and helping them, and she'd be really happy about that. Parents tended to kind of have this role of supporting and maintaining the use of the home language, and children told us that a lot of their parents felt that that was really important as well. So that as well as kind of keeping English to a high level, parents felt that it was really important that children maintain that kind of connection. So again, learning. As I said, we didn't talk as much as we expected to with children about this, but this could have been because most of the children we spoke to were relatively proficient in English already. So their multilingualism was less likely to be something that impacted their learning potentially. But again, quite a few children did say that they translated for their peers. So if they had a peer who spoke the same language as them, whose English proficiency was lower, sometimes they would kind of help out their friends. And all the children who described doing this felt like it was a positive thing, that they liked being helpful in that way. Teachers as well, children were positive about their relationships with their teachers. They really appreciated when their teachers showed an interest in the languages they spoke and maybe learned a couple of words. So this is Bilal from School One talking about how he had a teacher who herself was multilingual. And so this was kind of conversation that came from that. Children can also ask them about what languages they speak, and they will probably understand how it's good and bad, but mainly good to speak a different language because you're different, and that's a good thing. Okay, so that was what the children felt about their experiences and how they described them. So over to Alice for question 2.
Thank you, Emily. So I'm going to just outline sort of some of the findings we've got in relation to the second question about the context of the school. So I'm using a bit more of the data from the teachers here, and you'll hear some of the teachers' voices. And we interviewed class teachers and, where possible, an EAL lead or an inclusion lead in each of the schools, really to give us a bit of background to what the children were saying, to try and kind of understand the context. So we're also sort of bringing that data in to try and think about how the particular linguistic context, particularly of the schools, appeared to affect the children's experiences. And you'll have heard from what Emily said, some of the hints about how important it was, how many children were EAL in these different schools. So it was definitely important to think about linguistic context, both in terms of the overall proportion and also the balances of languages spoken. And really the message there is pretty simple, is that it actually really matters to your experience as an EAL child, how many other children there are who are EAL, and also what languages they speak. I'm also going to talk a bit about the status of EAL as an issue in the schools, both as a kind of national context, but also within the actual individual schools, because I think that also seems to make a difference. Thank you. So we've got these 4 schools. Sorry, thank you, Emily. We've got these 4 schools, and just to kind of remind you, we've got a mixture of kind of quite different patterns. And that we think that context of an overall EAL percentage actually seemed to make a difference to children's experiences. They either felt quite normal as an EAL child, or in some cases they felt quite other. And particularly school 3, where there was a lower level of EAL, we felt that that seemed to affect their experiences. They were more unusual, and that was kind of influencing how they talked about being an EAL child in that school. In the other end of the spectrum, we had children at school 2, which had very high EAL, who really, the teacher described it as not a major thing to be EAL, because most people are. It's just normal. It became, completely kind of standard within the school, to the extent that when we asked them about being EAL, they weren't really sure necessarily what we were talking about. So that definitely mattered. It also mattered what languages there were. As Emily mentioned, there was a mix of languages in all of the schools, apart from really in school 2, where most of the students spoke Bengali. And that again made a difference, because that kind of homogeneity made it less important. In other cases, we felt children were quite isolated sometimes if they were the only child who spoke that language within the school, because they really didn't have anyone to rely on to help them. There was also an issue about levels of language. So whether they spoke their home language or English better, but that didn't seem to be quite as important as we might think. The exception to that, though, was when children had quite basic levels of English. And that did seem to have a quite significant effect on their experience, though, of course, we had fewer of those children in the focus groups because they weren't necessarily able to participate. It also, I think it's worth saying that the size of the school mattered when we think about the kind of levels of training and support and the roles within the school. Okay, the next kind of little bit about the context that mattered, thank you, Emily, is about how much the teachers talked about languages being intertwined with other factors. And so this is Mariam, who is at school too, who talked a lot about how language is very much connected to identity. So their understanding of the EAL as an issue within the school seemed to be connected to how they understood issues to do with culture, friendships, parental engagement, and then that led into achievement and happiness. So they really thought that languages were kind of quite central to the whole kind of experience within their school. Next one, thank you. And that led to some people saying, sorry, back one, please. Thank you. That led to some people saying that actually what we need to think about is language within this kind of broader frame. This is Yasmin at School 3, who's talking about how if we're thinking about how we support someone when English is not their first language, we have to think about their emotional needs, their circumstances, for example, refugee children. And she says, actually, we need to have this kind of more holistic approach. It can't just be about language. We have to think about all of their needs first, because then we can do everything else. Related to that is the kind of general ethos of the school. And I think that seemed to be important both to the children and how they described their experiences, but also the teachers talked about it, about how they valued languages within their school. It was really noticeable when we were visiting as well in School 1 that they had these heritage sheets around the classroom, which they did at the beginning of the year. Very kind of simple thing where children write about their own experiences, their languages, their food, their different cultures, their religion. They draw flags, and they put it up all year. And actually, the children referred to this in the focus group as well. But here, the teacher Julia is talking about how that kind of gives out a signal to the children that their languages mattered. Similarly, Mariam in School 2 talks about naming their class artists after Bengali artists, representing diversity, the importance of valuing and representing diversity in multiple ways. There were also, I think it's worth noting, some issues, sort of technical differences between the schools, perhaps linked to ethos, about how the data about EL children is collected, how it gets passed on from different teachers to enact teachers, how it gets kind of represented in school data kind of tracking and so on. And that also seems to be, maybe doesn't make a difference necessarily to the children, but actually seems to be part of this kind of overall picture about ethos to do with EAL. One of the things we really noticed was how, for some schools, the EAL children were often grouped together with other children with additional needs, and in the widest sense. So there was this kind of umbrella inclusion, which was a phrase that was used by one of the teachers, and said that EAL is one of the needs that we have to think about. So here, Yasmin talks at School 3 about EAL as another need, which some children have, which is part of this kind of spectrum of needs, and also the fact that some children with EAL may also have additional needs. So there's this kind of, well, as Mariam says here, this overlap of different needs. It can be tricky to distinguish EAL as a separate category. In both of those schools, there was inclusion leads who were responsible for EAL provision. So inevitably, because of their kind of institutional role being the inclusion lead, EAL ended up being kind of brought into these input with other additional needs. However, there was also quite clearly a feeling that we need in practical terms to distinguish between EAL and other additional needs, special educational needs, because the support needed for these children was different. So Julia here is talking about difference between what a child that is dyslexic would need. They might need a laptop, they might need a microphone, whereas a child who's EAL might need extra help with their tenses, with their sentence structure. It's different support. And so I think the teachers were well aware, even if these things were kind of sometimes grouped together in how people talked about them, that actually often in terms of actual support in the classroom, they were different things. However, we also had discussions with the teachers about how, because of the lack of support in terms of staffing, not having enough teaching assistants and so on, sometimes EAL children would end up sitting with children with special educational needs because that's where the extra adult could be. And they might be helping them in different ways, but we felt that sometimes those two things were going to be conflated, ended up being mixed up simply because of the kind of structure of needing support from that adult. I think it's important to say that because of the kind of general deprioritization of EAL within policy and often within the Ofsted framework and other kind of factors, there is a slight concern within the field of people worrying about EAL not mattering anymore within schools. And that isn't something that we saw within our fieldwork. Certainly the teachers all recognised the importance of EAL and talked about how important it was to support children. However, in terms of staffing, there was only one of the schools, one out of the four, which actually had a designated EAL lead. And that was quite different. It was also a larger school, a fourth elementary school. So there's also implications there in terms of staff and budget and so on. So at that school, they had, it was a shared role between these two teachers, but it was very apparent that having a specific EAL lead meant that it was a really important focus, and it was seen as feeding into kind of all different areas within the school. So they talk about the training that they have. Whenever they have training, there's always, how can we support SEN or EAL? What more can we do? We just make our slides simple. And they say, it's always taking into consideration all our learners. And there was just this feeling that EAL kind of mattered within the school, even though they had a kind of average level, if you remember from the different patterns. And Nina says teachers are always expected to consider the EAL learners when they're planning their lessons. They see it as kind of inherent within the school. So that was a bit different. The others were all had an inclusion need. The other thing, the teachers, we asked about training, whether they felt well trained in relation to EAL children. And they generally said no, they didn't feel like they'd had an awful lot of specific training. It was something, Julia says, it's just something we keep in mind. She says, it is that we should consider actually reflecting during the interview that maybe we should start to think about this a little bit more. And then interestingly, Helen talked about how some information she got from some EAL training, which was over 10 years ago. And we just thought that showed that it was significant, that people were remembering things from 10 years ago, actually showed that training on EAL probably is something that teachers can remember and use in their daily practice. So one of the things that, just to kind of end on a slightly positive note, was that one of the things that came out of the interviews was actually the teachers, as I said, reflecting on what they do and thinking perhaps actually we need to do maybe more. As Yasmin says here, deepening our understanding and acceptance of other children's languages. Remember, that's the school where there are quite a small proportion of EAL children. She said, through this interview, I'm thinking, yeah, why not? We do a lot of celebrating diversity and inclusion in our school. That's based in our ethos, but this goes one layer more and it deepens it. So we thought that was quite interesting that when prompted, actually, they did begin to talk more. And then Nina was also talking about at School 4, even though they did quite a lot, they felt that there was more, they were going to change their displays, having the languages they speak. and having more kind of public displays of inclusivity. So some conclusions before we get to some kind of implications, and passing over to Charlotte in a moment. In relation to the children and their experiences, I think it's really worth emphasising that the children were really positive. They were very happy in school. They enjoyed using their home languages with their friends. Friendship was incredibly important. They felt valued being multilingual. They were proud of their culture. And they were generally very positive about their experiences. We did think it was interesting how they did act as translators, both for their parents and for their peers. They often talked about it quite positively, but I think it's something worth researching a bit more maybe in future, is how much they really feel they have a choice when taking that responsibility on, and whether it's fair to have children translating for other children within the classroom. They wanted more opportunities to use their home languages. There was this variation between the schools in how much they felt their home languages were valued. And it all depended on that kind of context. But in general, they wanted to use their home languages more because they were proud of them and they were excited to be special in being having EAL status. And then turning to the ones which are slightly more to do with the teachers, we think there is a risk of there's a danger perhaps that we might misidentify EAL children's needs, because there generally is this lack of national policy, a lack of prioritization. We think there can be sometimes a kind of simplification of what EAL children need, not necessarily present in these schools, but we can see how there are hints at maybe how children could end up either being categorized as having EAL but not really needing any support, so therefore kind of not really giving them anything at all, or as needing a lot of additional support and then ending up being conflated or sort of homogenized with children with special educational needs. And we think that is kind of that's the danger, where there is this kind of low prioritization of EAL. We also think that there's this bigger systemic pressures that actually are contributing to that situation, particularly the amount of curriculum there is to get through, the issues about teacher workload, obviously high stakes testing, and all of the issues in schools to do with budgets. All of those things are contributing to this deprioritization, which, although the children describe being very happy, we actually think it really matters in terms of supporting every child. And we think there is a bit of a risk that EAL children become just another group which we need to think or check on in terms of attainment data, rather than the kind of complex and interesting and fascinating children who have these great life stories and linguistic competencies that we saw within the focus groups. So we're going to share with you in a moment what we think kind of the implications are for classroom practice, but in terms of school and kind of general approaches, we think there are some lessons from what these children have told us. One thing is that we think it seems important to have kind of structures, if it's possible, to have a lead for EAL, because that just seems to help within the school as an institution to make sure this is an area which is prioritised. We also think that alongside general efforts to celebrate diversity, linguistic diversity should be celebrated. That means having languages days and things like that, having whole school events, or having displays or other kind of ways of being linguistically inclusive. And the children also told us that they wanted their home languages to be used in class more. They were proud of them, and they wanted simple things like making an effort to have multilingual displays, taking the register in home languages, very simple steps that could be used to just recognise and value the fact that they spoke another language. I'm now going to hand over to Charlotte, who's going to refer us to some more resources.
Thank you so much, Alice. What we've tried to do is to create a publication which we've just published on UCL Discovery, and the link to it should be coming in the chat so that you can download it directly there, just to try to disseminate all of the messages that you've had from Emily and Alice today, but also at the end of the document to put in some key recommendations for what can realistically be done in classrooms. There are some things based on what Alice has just said about how to have an EAL lead and the resources that can support them. We also were very concerned about that lack of training in the EAL area. So we've also signposted some key associations that we're able to help you with that as well. We'd highly recommend the Bell Foundation, and there's links to their website in the document for teachers training and resources. And to support EAL leads, NALDIC are fantastic as well. We also thought about the resources that children wanted in the classrooms and what would help them see their languages celebrated in the classrooms. So we've also put a link in there to Multilingual UK, and they are a leading publisher of resources in a range of languages, which can be really helpful for children to see their languages celebrated, for them to be able to read in home languages as well as in English, and for other children to see those languages being valued in the classroom as well. We've also broken down at the end of the leaflet about 15 key things for you to think about when you're implementing support for multilingual pupils in your classrooms. Hopefully, these will just be refreshers for most people, but they're the kind of really important reminders that we often need to come back to reduce some of the undue pressures on those children, and to actually have that license to take into account the time it develops as a language learner as well, making sure we give space for children to work through that often silent period they go through where they're taking on and absorbing language, giving the time to develop that important conversational language first so that they can develop those important social relationships with their peers, and then having that time to really hone and take account of the academic language. And as Alice said, all of that is really difficult in that culture where we're pushing for high stakes accountability and trying to get children through things in shorter and shorter time limits. So please do go and download the information leaflet, because lots of it is that common sense approach of things that we might just need a refresher of. And some of it will give you new ideas as well, and links to those important foundations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charlotte. So yeah, the link to that is in the chat if you want to take a look and share it widely. Obviously, we have shared some of our findings today, and as I said at the beginning, this is a very exploratory project. We were very open to kind of finding out how these children experience being multilingual in primary school. And this is a thread of our work within the Helen Hamlin Centre that we are continuing and exploring further. So we are really interested to hear your questions and comments. So please do keep adding them to the Q&A. We're going to start with the questions with one from Paul. So Paul makes a very good point that EL is now specifically mentioned in the Ofsted revised framework. Obviously, we did this research last academic year, so we were under the old Ofsted framework, so we should make that clear because the new one's only been around very recently. So the fact that EL is now specifically mentioned, Paul asks, I wonder if this will raise the profile of the needs of EL learners in schools practice.
Happy to answer that question about parents. So we didn't actually involve parents in this research. I think it is a really important perspective to have. And obviously, you know, in the conversations with children, they did talk about what they thought their parents might think about kind of using their languages in the classroom and sort of wider things to do with being multilingual. Future research, definitely. I would definitely like to talk to some parents of multilingual children and kind of get their perspective as well, because I think it's definitely a really, really valuable one. Yeah, thank you for the question.
Thank you. Yeah, and apologies if my connection is a little bit unstable. We have another question from Anonymous. Someone says, I'm wondering how the teachers or teaching assistants help the AL students during the lessons or catching up with the class. Well, obviously in this project, we didn't actually observe any classrooms or really kind of go into how that operated. I think the most information we have really is to do with using the teaching assistants to help children within the class. Teachers describing how they use them to help, but that isn't something. Are you able to consider or assess how multilingual children's experiences are shaped by pedagogy? For example, teachers are using bilingual books or books in multiple languages, and whether teachers use translanguaging.
I'll come to that one. Sorry, Alice, the beginning of it cut out again, but I've got the question. Yes, I mean we were more focused on sort of children's own experiences rather than looking directly at pedagogy. As Alice said, we didn't observe any lessons of that sort of thing. I think from speaking to teachers, I don't think any of them were sort of thinking about this translanguaging pedagogy necessarily, which, you know, translanguaging being the idea that languages are not necessarily kind of distinct units. You don't necessarily have, you know, German and then you have Chinese, but languages in practice are kind of a bit more fluid and people will borrow words from different languages and it really depends on context. So we didn't get into it hugely, but again, it's another area that I'm actually really interested in and would definitely want to find out a bit more and about whether specific pedagogies used by teachers actually do impact children's experiences, which I suspect that they do.
Charlotte, have you got any comments on bilingual books, books in multiple languages from your expertise?
Yeah, it's one of the reasons that we included the link to multilingual in the publication and resources. They do quite a lot of bilingual books in a range of different languages, but also in translation pens as well, so that you can get books read in other languages and translated into English as well. Do go and have a look up multilingual if you haven't seen them already, because lots of people are always asking for recommendations of where they can get books in other languages. Another one is to follow different authors and illustrators as well. We often see them reaching out on social media to say that they've got foreign editions of their books printed in other languages, and they know that schools are looking for books in certain languages. So often you might see some authors and illustrators giving away co-editions as well.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Next one, I've got a question about the use of EAL as a term. And the questioner asks, in the sense that it fails to capture the linguistic diversity and needs of students, do you think that this kind of terminology influences language policy and practice in schools? Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question. And obviously the problem with EAL is that it covers a very, very wide range of children with very different linguistic balance and numbers of languages and very different levels of English. And there is, I think you're right, it probably does influence how we do things in schools, because having one category means that people tend to be treated the same, or provision and support tend to be the same, rather than necessarily kind of covering all of those different needs. So it is a problem. And of course, around the world, EAL status is very different. In other countries, you are an English language learner, and then you can exit that status once your language has become competent, which is a totally different way. Whereas we tend to see EAL as something that you have that label all the way through. Although interestingly, the proportion of children at secondary school who are classified as EAL is lower, which suggests that when parents sign up their children for secondary, they don't always put them as EAL if even if they have done before. So definitely it is a problematic term, and that is kind of things at the heart of research like this, which tries to say, actually, you know, let's talk to children, let's find out what their experiences are, rather than seeing them all as one group. Emily.
Sorry, just wanted to add on to that and mention that the Bell Foundation has very recently published a report on multilingual children and attainment, which does say that English proficiency is the main factor that influences that, which is not something that is captured by the term EAL. So I think that is an example of like kind of that direct impact that a label that is sometimes used in a way that isn't quite reflective of not everyone has the same definition necessarily of it. So I think it does impact things. Yeah.
Actually, in fact, when our teachers talked about EAL status, they often said, that there are so many different types of EAL. Some children being listed as EAL, and this is actually another question, is actually English is their dominant language, because the parents both speak English as a second language, but they don't speak the same language, so everyone speaks English at home. So it's a really problematic term. It's the one that exists within policy, which is one of the reasons why we use it, or we use multilingual. But it means something different, slightly different, obviously, because it's the kind of labeling of school rather than necessarily what children might choose to call themselves. So there was a question about, did we have children who were classified as EAL, but whose main or dominant language was English? And did their perceptions differ from EAL children whose main language is one other than English? Emily?
Yeah, so there definitely were some children. So the way that we accessed these children was to ask the class teachers about which children in their classes were EAL and to kind of help us put together the focus groups. And there definitely were some children who sort of had English as their dominant language and then spoke another language, either sort of with some relatives, but not day to day, or sort of knew bits of it. In terms of how that impacted their experiences, I'm not sure, to be honest with you. I couldn't say off the top of my head exactly if their experience differed. I think most of the children who that was the case for, the ones who kind of had English as a more dominant language than their other language, felt quite a strong connection to the culture that associated with their home language, and they were quite proud of that and quite keen to describe themselves as I speak English and whatever their other language was. But that's a really interesting question, actually. And I think it just adds to that kind of idea of this term EAL is so broad and covers so many different experiences. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and then following on from that, there's a related question about how comfortable the children felt with the EAL label and what was their understanding of it. Thank you, Olga. Yeah, I mean, obviously the children don't really use the term EAL. It's not a phrase that they would necessarily use. And certainly when we talked to the children about why they had come, they said, oh, it's because we speak another language. So I don't know if we asked them directly, whether they would necessarily recognise the term or feel comfortable with it. But they saw the entire issue as being really framed, I think, in terms of speaking another language and that being a positive thing, rather than necessarily being put in a group by the school. Would you agree, Emily?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think the children would know what EAL meant, really.
No. Then we had another question from Julia, who says, were they interviewed individually or in groups, and how many times? So we did focus groups with them, so all of the children together, sharing and contributing and arguing with each other about in response to the various prompts and the various activities. We only spoke to them once, and one of the things I think we would like to do, if in any kind of larger project, would be to kind of build up that relationship more. Obviously, we did kind of rapport building activities, but if you went back to talk to children more and more, all of the evidence would suggest that you get more and more out of children the more times you go back and visit them. So that is something obviously we would like to do with a larger scale project. We've got an interesting question from Simon, who says, it would be interesting to know if the language country of the language country of origin has any impact on student and teacher perceptions? For example, is there a hierarchy of difference in value for certain languages over others? And did this come up at all? Thank you, Simon. That's a really interesting question. And certainly other research suggests that there are links between different languages and different perceptions and stereotypes about where children come from, and language becoming a kind of proxy for nationality, and therefore to do with kind of perceptions about children's home backgrounds and experiences. So I think the sort of pre-existing research would suggest there are these kind of hierarchies, certainly in perception of how languages are, how difficult they are, how easy it is to learn English if you speak another language. But I don't think we saw anything kind of from the children, particularly about some languages being valued more than others.
I would say it sort of potentially links to that question of children sort of questioning why they learn French and Spanish in school and not any other languages. I think there was one or two children who might have touched on that sort of idea, but yeah, it would be definitely interesting to explore more sort of their perceptions of like this perceived hierarchy. Yeah.
I think interestingly, the sort of friendship issue was related to that. So where there were, particularly where there were very small numbers of EAL children, they were tended to be friends with other children who spoke that language. For example, it was Polish in one of the schools. And so Polish became a kind of important language within that kind of context because it was one of the larger numbers of children, EAL children spoke it. So I think you probably get very individual kind of local hierarchies of languages, just simply to do with the numbers of children who speak that language. Not necessarily that they're valued in general more, but they're just ones that get talked about more, or ones that get used. And certainly we thought that in the school where the majority of people spoke Bengali, if you did speak another language, that might be also a little bit isolating because you would be quite different, and you would be EAL, but it wouldn't be the language which most people spoke. So I do, maybe local kind of context makes a difference. We've got a question here. How best could a year 4 or 5 or 6 teacher support a child who comes to school with no English? Charlotte, can I pass that one to you?
Yeah, I think the first thing is finding out as much as you can about the child. It's like any child. If you don't start with the child itself, where else do you start? So you would want to know which languages that they speak and which they speak fluently. Do they read in that language? Do they write in that language? And then follow some of the other guidance that we've put into the booklet as well. So whether the child can be buddied up with other children who speak that language, if you're lucky enough to have groups of children, allowing that time for them to talk and think in their own language before coming to English, thinking about whether if they are fluent in writing in their home language, can you write in their home language? I think there was another question in the chat, Alice, about is there a use for AI? Yes, absolutely. There's a use for AI. You can do so much more with translation of both written materials now, materials that are read and spoken materials now. So making the most of those things. But I think importantly is getting that child settled with the relationships within the class, having friendship groups, thinking about whether you've got TA support, whether you can look at moving through that hierarchy of language through naming basic things, communicating needs onto that social language, and then looking at how you can support into the academic side of things, use of visuals, translated resources. But very much it's about finding out about that child first and getting as much information as you can. Have they got favourite books? Are those favourite books available in other languages as well? How much schooling have they had in if they've come straight over from another country, and where does the school system start in that country? Because some countries will have school systems that start later, so they may have done not quite as much of the academic side of things before getting to year 4 and year 5. But yes, it's about the conference around that child, making them feel welcome, making them feel that they're valued, and establishing those social relationships that will get them into the conversational language, and then bringing in the academic language alongside.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. And obviously all of those resources that we're sharing are a great place to start. I think, in supporting any children arriving and who are completely new to English. I think we've got time for last couple of questions. There's one from John who says, "Is it not terrifying that EAL and SEND are lumped together?" I think it's something that has kind of often happened due to resourcing and due to this kind of support that you have in your classroom. I think sitting the children together is not terrifying. I think assuming that they all need the same thing is the problem. So it may be that for practical reasons, you might end up putting children on the same table, but the difference, as long as they're having different support, maybe that isn't quite such a problem. But yes, of course, it is a problem. Being EAL and having special education needs are entirely different things. And although children may, of course, have both, it is a real concern that perhaps because of this low prioritisation and a lack of resourcing, a lack of staff, teachers feel that their only way to support these children at all is to end up putting them together. And we did have examples of that within the data. So yes, it is a real problem, but I think it has to be seen within the context of classrooms and how they operate at the moment. I have another question from Christine saying, "Did any of the teachers you interviewed communicate the academic benefits of being multilingual?" Emily?
I think yes, a couple of them did. A couple of them noted that it's a huge advantage. Having kind of the linguistic competencies that come with knowing more than one language. I think teachers were aware of that. I think, as Alice says, the problem was kind of the being able to implement support where it was needed. Teachers were kind of quite positive about multilingualism, and they knew that it was a positive thing in general.
Yeah, and actually, one of the things that was interesting was teachers talking about their own multilingualism, and for those teachers who were multilingual, they could see how positive it was for them as well. So that kind of that was another interesting factor. And the children liked it that teachers had multiple languages too. That was also sort of part of building community of languages. Right, finally, just a follow-up question from Julia, who suggested, I think this is a good point, about to what extent the children's responses were influenced by the group dynamics of having a focus group. And maybe it would be interesting to investigate individual responses and to get further insights. And I think that's a good point, that, of course, children in a group may speak differently than others, though. I would say I think there are differences between the children. They were willing to argue with each other and to disagree and to express different opinions. But obviously, yes, it would be interesting to hear what they say when they're on their own. And there are all the usual caveats about how children talk to grown-ups when they come into your school and want to talk. Though I do think Emily did a great job at kind of building rapport and getting them to relax and talk from what I could see. So we have run out of time. Sorry to those people we haven't managed to answer your questions. We'll upload the recording, and you can use all of these links to find more information about our centre and to follow what we're doing. Thank you very much for your attendance, and we hope to see you at another event soon. Thank you.
Thank you.